A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. I seek refuge in Allah from Satan the accursed. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. Brothers and sisters in Islam and in humanity, Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to the Shari'ah Intelligence course. I am your host, Muhammad Nurudeen Lemu, and with me to discuss today's topic are two of our colleagues with the Dawah Institute, Sister Salatu Sule and Brother Ibrahim Bello. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
In today's discussion, we are going to look at the evolution of the field called Usul al-FIQH. In other words, how did things evolve from the time of the Prophet, where people just ask the Prophet questions, to a time where we have this very complicated field called Usul al-FIQH that regulates juristic reasoning. But before we go into that question, I'd like to try and share with our colleagues a question which I hope they will help enlighten us on, which is it not enough for Muslims to just focus on the clear teachings of the Qur'an and Sunnah without bothering about this subject called Usul al-FIQH? So I'll start with Sister Salatu. Why don't we just stick with the Qur'an and the Sunnah that is clear? Why do we need to go further?
When we think about the Quran and the Sunnah, and we know, yes, there are some of those things that are very clear, they are explicit. The verses are clear, they are straightforward, and you have pronouncements of the Prophet on the same thing. We have these verses that then help establish what you call the essentials of the religion. Essential Tawheed, this concept of one God. Essential acts of ibadah, your prayer, your fast, zakah. Essentials of akhlaq, how you behave, your character. What are those qualities that every human being is expected to have based on the Quran and Sunnah? If a person's intention or your focus is really about remaining a Muslim, then yes, you can stick to those ones and it would be enough. Indeed, there was a man who asked the Prophet ﷺ, if I pray, if I fast, and he mentioned a few of those essentials, is that enough? And the Prophet ﷺ said, yes, you stick to those things, it is enough. However, that's just one aspect of being a human being. This question of your relationship with your Creator. You have your relationship with other human beings around you, your relationship with the earth on which we live, with the world around us. As a result of our daily interactions, social interactions, the choices we make, the changes that occur around us, you have shifts happening all the time. So you have changes and the challenges that come with those changes, the novelty that comes with those changes, the questions that have to be answered, whether it's in the field of medicine or technology or science or human interaction or international relations. We think of maps from centuries before. What you called a nation then, you don't call a nation now. So when these changes happen, people still have to live. They have to exist. And you cannot, as a Muslim, say, well, there are some things you keep to the mosque, or when you're doing just nasiha, and then you go out and live life as you want. When it comes to those changes, dealing with them, then it becomes important to engage with more than just the essentials of the religion. Allah mentions in the Quran that in the verses that He has revealed, there are those verses that are muhkamat, they are very clear, they are explicit. Then there are those that are mutashabihat, they are allegorical, metaphorical. The meaning is not as straight and as explicit as other verses, but it's all the Quran. When we want to understand those verses, when we want to understand the implication of those verses in our lives as Muslims, when we want to go into the question of, is a particular verse just describing a context, describing an action, or is it prescribing, saying this is how we must do it, then we definitely have to do more than just say, what does the Quran say, what does the Sunnah say? And that is where Usul al-FIQH comes in. As we've said before, Usul al-FIQH is the part that looks at what are the available sources of law or rulings that are there, and how do you rank them, how do you order them. If we do not use Usul al-FIQH, if we don't respect that field, we'll end up giving answers that are misleading or that are wrong or that misrepresents the spirit of Islam. Because with Usul al-FIQH, it's saying here are things you could do and here is how you could go about doing them. If we go back to an example we've used in the past, cooking, ingredients, how you prepare those ingredients, that's usul al-fiqh. What you do at the end, the result, depends on how did you use the ingredients. If I use a common example, back home growing up, there is what we call gari, which is really just granulated cassava, dry. Typically, if you want to make it, you need hot water and you need gari, that's all. It seems so simple. But I remember the first time I tried to make it, when I was done, I found that I had poured the water into the gari, and in the middle, it was still very dry, the rest was wet, and my sisters began to laugh. And they said, oh, this is when you know a newbie. This is when you know someone who's just learning. And they said, no, you never ever put the gari first into the bowl, then the water. You actually pour the water first, then you pour in the gari, and there's a speed to it. So it's not as simple as water and gari. Similarly, existing as a Muslim day to day is not as simple as here is the Quran, here is the Hadith, now go live your life. There is more involved. Usul al-Fiqh helps us regulate the more involved so that we are not freestyling religious instruction, that there is some stability, and that the maqasid of the religion, those higher intents, those aims, are respected. Are we conscious of the need to preserve life, to preserve religion, to preserve family relationships, to preserve the dignity of human beings, to preserve justice, that those aims are still continuously kept in sight? That's the role of usul al-fiqh.
Thank you. Ibrahim, would you add anything to that, please?
Yes. More so, usul al-fiqh is more like trying to represent the prophets on matters arising that need religious certification and backing. And so we really need to know how he used to. It's more about methodology, simple. How was the prophet and the Sahabas used to? Even it was not documented, it was not spelled out, but is a common sense. Whatever you are used to doing, people can see a consistency in your way of doing things. So usul al-fiqh is about articulating this methodology and ways for the benefit of new issues to come, for the benefit of matters that will arise. So it's not just that usul al-fiqh is a new science that's fall from heaven, but it's about refining a methodology that was once the prophet was the master, he was even a Shari'ah. Sahabas could see why and how. But then people need to, if these things were not documented, how do we make sure people coming later, their ways of articulating issues and assigning them religious rules and verdicts is faithful to the intent of Sharia and his consistent methodology? Most of the times, when people do fatwas that are not faithful to these patterns, they're only dealing with raw texts, without context, and without knowing the intent and the spirit of Sharia. You could see it flowed with errors. Think of somebody being asked, is it permissible to use a modern WC toilet? He said, well, it's a waste of water. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ الْمُبَذِّرِينَ كَانُوا إِخْوَانَ الشَّيَاطِينَ كَانَ الشَّيْطَانُ لِرَبِّهِ كَفُورًا. That those who are extravagant, they waste, they're just brethren of the Satan, and Satan disbelieves. So this person waste, brother to Satan is a kafir.
Plus.
You know, that kind of linear equation of a thing, and you just treat Islam like that. You could see this kind of justifications in most of the conclusions, immature conclusions, the Boko Haram and some of these extreme groups do when they translate and interpret Quranic verses. Too superficial, too literal, doesn't respect methodology and the spirit and the intent of the Prophet and Sahabas. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much. I think, you've made it clear that while to be a Muslim, you need to just follow the fundamental essentials, the ma'alumin ad-din bid-darura, those clear teachings that are undisputed. However, to be a Muslim that is solving societal problems, especially responding to changing society, and that's the nature of reality and culture and social, political life. The moment you're going to respond to changing realities, as the Sahaba had to respond to changing realities, the need to agree on the methodology for that response. And that methodology is what Usul al-Fiqh is. And what scholars have done is to try and extract that methodology by studying the Ijtihad of the Sahaba, but also looking at how the Prophet responded to issues that are not in the text. And I think we will see more examples of these as you have put it nicely. The other question I'd like is, now that we appreciate the importance of Usul al-Fiqh in Ijtihad, and Ijtihad is necessary, it's even a fardu kifaya, it's a collective responsibility. We must have scholars who are doing and performing this task. Yeah. How did the study and the field of Usul al-Fiqh begin? How did it evolve during the first couple of generations of the Prophet ﷺ? What was the ABCD of this field, Malam Ibrahim?
Okay, Usul al-Fiqh and Fiqh, they're from the same source. So discussing about how Usul al-Fiqh come to be is actually saying, how do we have the product, which is the Fiqh? The thing is, actually a number of scholars have written. Earlier on you have As-Sunnah to Qabla Tadween, written by Khatib Baghdadi. And more recently you have Evolution of Fiqh by Abu Amin Bilal Philip. You equally have the Arabic equivalent, which we call Tarikh al-Tashri' al-Mazahib al-Fiqhiyya. Basically, you can look at it as trying to refine like a method. It's a method that has been in existence, but it continues getting better till our modern time. When the Prophet was alive, you have the first generation or in the evolution of Usul al-Fiqh. You call Jailus Sam'i. They were eyewitness. They knew why and how the Prophet did it. And in fact, when they have issues with revelation or meaning of Quran, they rush to the Prophet. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَالْكَافِرُونَ هُمُ الظَّالِمُونَ. They went to the Prophet. What does it mean? الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَلَمْ يَلْبِسُوا إِيمَانَهُمْ بِظُلْمٍ. The Prophet will explain. So the Prophet was there to explain, and they knew the context and why. He taught them how to perform ablution, how to pray. They knew the emphasis he gave each of them. So they had no issues, and there wasn't fear of abuse or anything. Thereafter, the Prophet passed away. And you're now left with Sahabas, with students, and people you call Tabi'un, the followers of the Sahabas. These are now the students of the Sahabas. Sahabas were part of it because they were taught by the Prophet directly. So they are now having students who are now learning from the Sahabas. They had little issues too, because they were still close to the origin. A number of Sahabas were still there, even though less was documented. But Sahabas have this mechanism ingrained in their own brain. They knew why. There was little or no disagreement because Sahabas were there. So this you call Jailu al-Jam'i. So they now begin, okay, so that we don't get to lose these things later. At the tail end of this generation, they started documenting and compiling. But then there was less emphasis to analogy of the methodology. Why? Sahabas were there to clarify for them. Now, as time goes on, Sahabas were dying. And these people now were now the scholars. So they had students who were the students of Sahabas. Tabi'ut Tabi'in. And so the fear of men who lose track. Some of the things we know, they may not necessarily know it. And they start losing track with the origin. They start having missing links. And so there was a need to settle down to analyze all these things and really see the path and the pathways to get consistent answers and responses that we are almost sure we are representing Islam and is in line with the intent of Sharia. And this led to the generation of Usul al-Fiqh. And the first person to actually articulate this thing in a book form is Imam Shafi'i. But then it didn't come new to scholars because they knew there was need for it. So it's like I say, just one thing getting better. It's like in the last 100 years, how do we measure? Maybe people, an adult will just take 2 bags of rice and compare and say, no, this is bigger, but that's too raw. Then you come and have a scale that can only give measurement in kilogram. And they continue to refine it day in, day out, until you can measure to the last microgram, nanogram. So it's the same thing happening. It's actually not a new thing at all. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Salah, would you have anything to add to that?
Actually, I think he has finished everything.
Good. What I would pick, and just to separate what you could describe as the generations. The generation of the Sam'i, those who listened to the Prophet, they were eyewitnesses of the Prophet. And at that time, as you said, no big problem.
Yes.
After that, the gatherers, the Jam', those who started to gather, they could see people were dying, the need to start collecting opinions of the Prophet ﷺ, hadith, and then you had all this data out there, and then you needed the next generation to start analyzing and agree on the methodology, the Jil al-Fiqh or Usul al-Fiqh, where people started to agree on the methodology. And I guess after that you then had subsequent generations that looked into the Qawaid of Fiqh and the Maqasid of Sharia, all trying to improve the methodology to deal with changing realities. The question I'd like to ask next to Sister Salatu is, fiqh or usul al-fiqh, which one came first? Brother Ibrahim told us that in a sense he didn't look at Shafi as the founder. Could you elaborate this whole issue of the beginning of fiqh and usul al-fiqh? Because I would say the books of fiqh were written before the books of usul al-fiqh. So if the Muwatta of Imam Malik came before the Risala of Shafi, if the books by Ash-Shaybani and the early Hanafi scholars came before, how do people view usul al-fiqh as coming before fiqh if the books on fiqh are actually what came before?
Okay. I'll start with that last statement. The books of fiqh came before the books of usul al-fiqh. Those are the books. Fiqh is the result, as we've said before, of certain steps, certain actions that have now been equated with usul al-fiqh or ijtihad using usul al-fiqh. When you look at the Muwatta of Imam Malik, it's a fiqh book basically, but how were those results derived? How were those rulings drawn? Where did they come from? If any of those rulings was not simply echoing what is explicitly stated in the Qur'an and the Sunnah, it means definitely whichever jurist, whichever scholar produced that fiqh did something more. And that more is that striving, it's that ijtihad. And what did the scholar do? The scholar looked at other tools. The scholar looked maybe at how are the scholars, is there a consensus among scholars on this? That's ijma. Is this one of those situations where the scholar looked at, well, there's already a ruling, and this situation or this context or this question is similar to that question which already has a ruling, and the illah, the cause or the reason why this ruling was given, or the hikmah, the wisdom behind it, I can see that it also applies here, so I'm simply going to apply that to this. That's qiyas. Now, why does it appear as though fiqh came before usul al-fiqh? Because the results came, they were documented, but as Brother Ibrahim has just finished explaining, the actual analysis and structuring of that whole field, where scholars are delving into what we call the secondary sources, that whole thing came much later. It moved much more slowly. It's like you say you want to have a meal, for instance, or you want to go to a restaurant to have a meal. What you're interested in, what people are interested in when they go to a restaurant is the food, not the recipe, not who's in the kitchen, not who's behind the door.
Absolutely.
There was a time when it was not common to have food shows No, people just go to a restaurant to eat. But you find now we have food shows. You talk of Chef Ramsay and Chef this and Chef that. And that is when people start realizing just by sitting down in their sitting rooms, they can learn to prepare such meals that they never thought of before. I think a similar thing also happened here when we look at the evolution and the history. What Imam Shafi'i did simply was to get all that knowledge, that wisdom about how the fiqh is arrived at and put them together in a book. He was the first to actually do that. So that's why it seems like it's almost the chicken and the egg kind of question, which came first. But when we look carefully at history and we go beyond the terminologies, the actual contents, the kernel, we understand that the usul came first before the fiqh itself.
Well, Ibrahim?
Yeah. It is true, and that could be seen clearly when you look at the consistent methodology scholars use in defending their arguments and their positions in the past. Shafi'i learned a whole lot of methodology from Malik. Muwatta is not just a book, but it's a book that is based on a methodology, which is clear to those who study it. It's like a model. In medicine, you have a medical model. So, this tells you that there was a system in place. And when Shafi'i left Malik after his demise, he went to Kufa, he got more experience, he changed some of his opinions based on some new things he learned. So, in other words, fiqh is actually a product. For the fact that it was not articulated just meant it was well known to scholars and people of that time. And that is why we should appreciate the generation that were closer to the source. Because they knew why, they knew the context, they knew a number of things. There are some things that are like common sense things. Like Malik will say most of his rulings are based on this and this and that. And whatever is not in Quran and Hadith is because of this. Sometimes they will ask him and you confidently say, well, amalu indana. It means like there is a path he is following. So these are some of the justifications that usul al-fiqh actually came before fiqh. But of course it's because the fruit, the product was what come to be, what is known. And particularly scholars, compile these compendiums of fiqh according to context and mazahib to make it easier for beginners and learners. And for the fact that they know, for a common man to approach directly the books of Quran and Hadith, you find a lot of complexity and confusion. So fiqh was like make it easier for a beginner's guide to the real message in Quran and Sunnah. That's why people come to believe or see that fiqh comes before usul al-fiqh. Else it is actually the opposite.
Thank you very much. So I think you've clarified a number of things. One being that Sahaba did Ijtihad. From Umar to Ali and Abu Bakr and others, they did do their ijtihad, but they didn't write down their methodology. All we have is the conclusions that Umar made this policy or Umar suspended this or did this or that. We have these fiqh rulings being documented, but what was not earlier documented was the methodology, which I think is what Shafi felt this was necessary. He did the first writing on the thing, but not that there wasn't a methodology in place before. And what you're saying is just he was the first to articulate it, put it in writing, and others followed suit.
I think to highlight it, he just highlighted what was already there.
Good.
And I think when it comes to the fact that the fiqh was more popular, because that was what was commonly required or needed, not necessarily the usul al-fiqh. That's more specialization, specialist style.
Good.
Yeah.
And I think it will probably apply to many other fields like ulum al-Quran, ulum al-Hadith, ulum al-Tafsir, usul al-Tafsir, and some of these fields where Hadith criticism was going on. Concepts like Tawheed and Uluhiyya and Rububiyya and Asma wa Sifat, and there was that understanding, but the articulation of the methodology, the classifications, what today is a complex field of Hadith criticism, it's not that that was absent in the earliest generation. And probably an important point to note is that the first collections of hadith were actually the books of fiqh. These came way before Imam Bukhari and Muslim and others started compiling. So as you mentioned, there was the generation that listened directly to the Prophet. There was the generation that started compiling, Shihab al-Zuhri, teachers of Imam Malik, and that generation were the gatherers. And then later you had the analysts and the generation that started articulating that methodology, which I think it's important to remember that therefore Usul al-Fiqh is not some new bid'ah.
No.
It's not some new thing that came during the time of Shafi or after the earliest period. What we had is different schools, and probably Imam Shafi igniting the interest in other schools to also start articulating their own methodologies. The other question that I'd like to ask is to look at other fields related that guide Ijtihad, and how were these developed. So what other major fields related to guiding the field of Ijtihad were developed after Usul al-Fiqh, and what roles did these contribute or emphasize on when guiding the process of Ijtihad or improving the quality of Ijtihad? Malam Ibrahim.
Yes, like you mentioned earlier, the science of Hadith come to be. Yeah, it wasn't there before because there was no need for it. Nobody doubted who says what. As long as you say the Prophet say, I trust you, fine and good. But then as the generation go further from source, there was need to really look, be sure, so that you don't lie against the Prophet. Same thing with Usul al-Fiqh. And of course, just like Usul al-Fiqh, Imam Shafi ignited the discussion, and it continued to develop over and over time. There is Maqasidu Shari'ah, the higher intent of Shari'ah. In other words, what do all these rulings of fiqh and all these permutations and combination seek to serve? Like, where is it leading us to? So Imam Malik and the Maliki Mazhab made a lot of contribution in the development of that. You could see that that is also like an offshoot of Usul al-Fiqh in a way, but then it has a broader perspective, because sometimes Usul al-Fiqh may be limited to Mazhab. Then you have Qawaid al-Fiqh here, which is more like your, okay, for the practical purposes, what are our guiding rules? Okay, if we want to implement Usul al-Fiqh, how do we make sure we have a check? And so Imam Abu Hanifa and his Mazhab did a lot. And all these three put together makes the system more perfect, nearly perfect really. And more classic, but then are more reliable, because they serve as check from one another. You graduate from Usul al-Fiqh to Qawaid al-Fiqh here. Okay? And then the Maqasidu Shari'ah is the bigger picture, is the direction, is the compass. So all of these things are related, and you could see that over time all the schools of thought actually contributed to development of this.
This is very interesting. In other words, when we look at the evolution of Usul al-Fiqh from when it wasn't written to when it was now articulated, we find, as you said, Shafi scholars being among the first to write in this subject area, and others then started picking. The Hanafi scholars then started writing more and probably did some of the most important works in the field of Islamic legal maxims, of Qawaid al-Fiqhiyah or legal philosophy. But also we find the very big contributions of people like Imam Shatibi, Ibn Ashur, and some of these scholars to the field of Maqasid, and how the contributions of all of these have given a very useful, very agile tool for quality control and improvement of Ijtihad as we move into the future. Would like to take this opportunity to say thank you to both of you for your contributions. Inshallah, when next we meet, we will be looking at other topics, and inshallah we will be looking at the Sharia rulings. When we say something is halal or haram and makruh or mubah, what does all of that mean, and how are these determined? Why are they important? Inshallah. For now, we'll say thank you to our guests, and to you till next time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.